mean, I talk to a lot of people in the tech industry, as you do too, Etienne, and a couple of problems keep coming up, certainly. And the thing is, there's a lot of phenomenal tech being built out there. I mean, it's super amazing what's out there, but I find that in talking to people in these tech leadership positions, what's keeping them up at night a lot is the sort of the how part. Like, am I hiring the right way? Is my workflow tech stack up to par? Like, what's the highest value improvement I can make? Because like, CTOs, like you said in the intro, right? Like your head is down, you're pushing all the time, and it's kind of hard to stay aware of everything that's going on. And in particular, the thing you said, right? Like tech leaders understand that their operations are producing this mountain of data, and it's super useful, and there's information buried in there, but they're not using that data as well as they could. And everybody I talk to understands they could be leveraging this data to make better decisions. It's just like, how do I do it? Where do I find the time to sort of kind of go down the paths that maybe aren't quite right to get to the right thing? That's kind of the thing that seems to keep coming up a lot.
So you think about like a typical software company, right? You're going to have, you think about all the internal data, first of all. So, every software company's got a bug database. They've all got, source control, massive amounts of source control history. You've probably got like a customer support ticket system. But really what we find is a lot of these companies, right? There's like big silos between those data sets. And then they don't really leverage that data to effectively answer what's the next thing to work on. And you end up sort of over relying on intuition and gut instinct. Don't get me wrong, right? Like your talent, your gut instincts, those are what got you, to where you are. But the question is whether you're really using data to answer the question. Should I go, for example, refactor a piece of software, or should I go pursue this other product opportunity, right? If you use the databases I mentioned, you can actually get a lot of help towards answering those questions.
Kind of from the finance perspective, is a lot of it is like learning how to sort of put a dollar value on things. And as a trader, that's kind of the number one thing you learn again and again, is like, there's this uncertainty, there's this uncertain decision. How could I put a dollar value on it with some error bars? I can use that dollar value to sort of compare it to other dollar values. And that's kind of the mechanism we try to sort of help people do.
What you'll see, right, is you'll get, I mean, I'm sure you guys have been in situations where, let's say a product manager or a CEO is saying, well, we really need to go after this business opportunity. It's going to bring in X amount of revenue. And then you'll get a technical person arguing, oh, well, you don't understand. We have this crusty code and we're using deprecated APIs, right? And the business people in the room are looking at you like, what are you talking about? What's a deprecated API, right? So they're not speaking the same language. You got someone talking dollars and you got someone talking technical constructs, right? And so that's what Augustin's talking about, is can you take, for example, like an example might be something like technical debt, right? Can you take that cruddy code that we all have, those skeletons that are buried in the closet in your code base, and actually turn that into sort of like a dollar number? And then what happens is the conversations you have in your company become much more well lubricated, right? Because you can say, well, I can make $10 million taking this opportunity on spending, I don't know what it is, making up numbers, 5 million just maintaining this code. And it just becomes almost like an automatic economic decision as opposed to sort of a deadline. I'd always rather do fire prevention than firefighting, right? So we love it when companies call us early. Like when we did, we came in with Ryan, actually, it was great because, it wasn't sort of a crisis situation. We did a half-day workshop with him and I think kind of teed up some ideas. But yeah, we get a mix, Etienne, honestly. We have seen teams call us kind of in a bit of a panic about technical debt. And that's really tough to really help companies too much in that situation, right? Because it's pretty clear, like when your technical debt gets really bad, the solution's kind of obvious. You just have to sort of drop everything and pay down the debt, right? It's like a financial crisis. You're like, your paycheck is just going, where it's going to go. It's going to go to your creditors, right? So there's really not too much you can do there. What's great is when we get sort of early engagement with like a younger company, because they're like, oh, they can sort of see a little bit in the future and they want to learn how to prevent it. Then there's some things that we can do that are some best practices.
At some level, the skill of a good data scientist coming into a company is actually sort of the sociological thing, like interacting with the people, understanding kind of the domain-specific knowledge that people have, and how to cast that in a form where you can use data to help you make those decisions. I think sort of the best machine learning data science stuff that I've seen and done over the years is kind of when you merge the two. Like in my case, kind of the old school trader who's sort of seen markets for 25 years and knows how things work, but doesn't necessarily know much more than how to run Excel spreadsheets. And you merge that with sort of terabyte scale data sets and sort of pull out some insights and prior beliefs. And that's where the magic happens. Getting back to your example, I think one of the most powerful things you can do with data is actually just show everybody on the team. Like one of the things we're huge fans of is get some KPIs that everybody can kind of get behind, put them up on a huge TV monitor in the break room, and that's it. Like test coverage is like a great one to use, right? It's not like everybody has to do this, but like test coverage is great, right? Like everybody sees that graph kind of ticking up every day, and it just sort of gets people behind the effort, gets people on the same page, aligns people's interests, which is super critical. And it doesn't take a huge amount of data science. It's like plumbing a couple of data sources through a couple of visualizations, then boom, right? Like you have a different culture.
I think what's, just to add to that, I think what's particularly challenging about, as you guys know, as CTOs, with software and technology, the problem is the data is to a large extent hidden. I mean, so one analogy we give when we kind of do workshops with folks is you think about like, think about if you're Toyota, right? To pick a manufacturing example, right? And you look at, something like an airbag recall, right? Like the CFO of Toyota, I'm quite sure knows down to the penny how much they spent on recalling all those cars and putting in new airbags, right? It's very clearly, it's like you can think of it as a regression, right? That they paid dearly for. But the thing is in tech, like let's say you have a bug that gets exposed to your customers, right? And maybe your staff spends, I don't know, a few hundred hours fixing it. There actually is usually there's no accounting of that, right? It's just sort of like, some guy maybe worked the weekend. Maybe you have to have a little tiger team of 4 people work for a month. It doesn't show up on the balance sheet, right? The CFO doesn't see that. And so that's really the challenge, is a lot of these data sources are hidden. So yeah, you could hire a data scientist, but if they don't have this intuitive understanding that, this idea of hidden costs in technology, they're not going to know like where to pick, where to go look at your different databases and pick out the right data.
I think that's the stage at which we end up talking to a lot of companies, is when their technical team has gotten big enough that they have to sort of start training that first layer of technical manager. And small companies historically just, at least the ones that I've talked to, like they just don't prioritize the notion that that is a job that needs specific training to do. And there's so many stories of like great individual contributor, now they're managing a team of 4 people, and now you lose the great individual contributor and you gain a bad manager, and like now everything's worse, right? Like just unilaterally worse. So part of the thing we do with teams and kind of the audits we do and that sort of thing is look at what that process is for training managers, identifying all that stuff.
Yeah, I read that Accelerate book by Jez Humble and more. And there are 4 key indicators in there that kind of really highlight how to determine how productive and how efficient software companies are. But I struggle a little bit, and we haven't spent much time on this at my company, but I want to turn those metrics, I'm assuming you know what I'm talking about here, turning those into a dashboard or actionable metrics for the team. Do you have any suggestions on tools we can use for that, or any examples where that's been done?
Yeah, I can start, and Augustine, feel free to jump in here as well. The first thing I would say about KPIs is, like Augustine said in his TV example, extremely powerful, but also conversely extremely dangerous for the same reason. It's a bit of a double-edged thing. So for example, we've seen companies where, like an obvious thing is you could put a KPI on the number of open customer support tickets, or the duration the support ticket is open. Like if you're talking about an external KPI, like customer issues, right? And if you do something like that, you got to watch out, because then what will happen is, your customer support engineers will just be incentivized to essentially close the tickets as fast as they can, not to actually keep the customer happy. The same thing with, like, a lot of people want to do KPIs around how many bugs are outstanding in the code, right? But again, it's the same problem. Then, which you don't want to create a KPI that is unbalanced, is what I'm trying to say, right? So you always in your KPIs want to look for balance. So if you want to put a KPI on how many, what's our bug closure rate, for example, which I think is a good KPI, I would recommend balancing it with feature ask or feature production rate KPI, right? Because there's always a trade-off. You could spend, your whole staff burning bugs down or adding features. What you're looking for is that balance. So that's the first general comment I would make, is look for balance. And then the second thing I like about KPIs is I do like KPIs that have both a near-term horizon and a long-term horizon, right? Because there are sort of initiatives perhaps that you're trying to get your team to. Like usually there's some, as a CTO, especially, there's a North Star that you're after, right? Maybe you want to improve efficiency, but improving efficiency might take you a year. So you got to think about, well, what does efficiency mean to me? Try to quantify it. There's some ideas around that. What does efficiency mean? It's a very interesting question. Just that alone, maybe another hour. But you try to kind of quantify your North Star, I think is important. Otherwise, what will happen is your KPIs become very noisy, right? And then you kind of can thrash your team around a little bit.
And Mark, to answer kind of your question about kind of operationally how to do that, I think, again, coming from my perspective on the trading side, like you really want to automate as much of it as you can. Like sort of the mythical TPS report is like, it's a joke, but it's a joke for a good reason, right? Like there really are people out there whose job it is to write reports about how efficient other people's jobs are being done, right? Like it's a joke, but it's true. And the thing is, like, now more than ever, like in the last few years, like there's this massive opportunity with tooling around like visualization tools, like, even just something like Tableau or related other tools where they suck data in automatically. You sort of set up the KPIs to sort of generate reports automatically. You can sort of make them as granular or as global as you can, as you want to. And then it's just like, okay, every morning I get an email, blah, blah, blah. Every morning such and such a person gets an email, blah, blah, blah. And you can always dig into the data. But this is something I feel like is fairly new actually surprisingly fairly new in technologies, like just automating a lot of these things.
I wholeheartedly agree. In fact, we've had a lot of success setting up customers with Power BI. We have a product that we kind of package around it. And one of the things I like about these tools that Augustin's talking about, Tableau, Power BI, is it allows you to actually, like I talked earlier about those siloed data sets. So let's say you did want to you want to look at bug burn downs, but you also want to look at feature production rate. But they're usually in two separate databases, right? And you got Jira over here for one, and you got, I don't know, Bugzilla or something over here. But all these things now have, they have APIs, and you can, so what you can do is you can get those two databases, munge them into one, level data set, and then you can make visuals on them.
And this is just to like kind of put a bow on it. Like this is a thing that you could do, right? Like this is a thing like everybody can do. It's not hard. It's just like, it's not a core competency. It's not a super high priority day to day. And so it's like, if you could just sort of like accelerate your way to getting that and get it set up and sort of bootstrap your way to it, I think that there's a huge value there.
That's right.
Yeah. So what can you talk a little bit more about tools that do this? So I wouldn't want to task the team with writing all the tooling to set this up. Like what can bootstrap us?
Well, my personal favorite's Power BI, but a lot of people also use Tableau. Like the tools are similar in what they do. They understand native databases.
Right. Like the sort of the transfer layers are all mostly written, right? Like if you have something in any remotely industry standard thing, those layers are already written. And so it's more about literally plumbing, connecting. It doesn't take a huge amount of time if you know how to do it right.
That gets to another rule of the art of KPIs, right? So you always want your KPIs to be actionable, and you want them to you want them to be goal based. Sometimes you can draw pictures and visualizations, but it doesn't really tell you. Is it like, to your point? Is that good? Is it bad? I don't know. Is the line supposed to go up? Is it supposed to be a hockey stick? So I do agree with you that good KPIs are goal based. And they work, right? Like Agustin said, they motivate people. I do think you need context, and you need to get people to rally around it.
Right. You can't just put up a graph in the break room and sort of assume that everything will be great. Like you need education. Right. It's part of what we do actually, is kind of getting people thinking about sort of what goes into making a good decision. And again, this idea of aligning people's interests, right? Like if I'm being sort of compensated and promoted based on something, then that that something, that KPI or whatever, has to be aligned to the business goal in some sort of deep way.
It's actually really important when you insert that first layer to have a management philosophy, you know, and it doesn't have to be complicated, but you need to have some, you know, notion of what is your philosophy. In other words, how are you going to promote people? How are you going to reward people? You know, what is your title structure going to be? Is if you don't have that, it's, you know, it's very difficult to undo staffing decisions, as you guys know, right? Product decisions are actually easier. You can make U-turns in your product. It's hard, but to do a U-turn on a staffing thing, that's really painful actually, because you have to sort of re-level set everybody's expectations. So important that you do that early, have a philosophy, and then start training people in that, and then everything goes so much more smoothly. Yeah, definitely I wouldn't say more than 7. I mean, you know, 4 or 5 direct reports is probably industry standard, but obviously every company is unique. It's really about, really I think, you know, with specifically on performance management, it's about this consistency I talked about, right? Like what drives employees crazy is when the bar shifts, right? That creates a perception of unfairness, right? So the question you have to have is, do you have a system for how you're going to promote people, how you're going to reward people, how you're going to manage low performers, right? That's actually super important. Yeah, to get that right from the outside.
If you look at it from a long perspective, the pendulum actually swings rather readily. Like if any of you have seen Mad Men, like the show set in the 60s, like everything was so like official and ossified and like very, very rigid, right? And now like the pendulum has swung maybe completely the other way, where things are, because we're trying to be lean, we're not trying to be very efficient, we're trying to move fast. And so now there's maybe an excess of anarchy. And I feel like this pendulum's actually swinging back to maybe a better middle ground now.
I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. I would say, yes, you're right, Augustine, there's just the axis of kind of organization. Then the other axis I would point to is this question of, and I think you were hinting at it, Etienne, is this feedback dimension. So for example, maybe a lot of you read Ray Dalio's book, Principles, right? Very popular business book. And so he you know, he's on one end of the spectrum, right? Where he talks about radical transparency, right? And, you know, your new hire intern should be able to blast an email to the CEO saying he's an idiot. You know, that kind of thing where people usually are mortified to work. Most people, I think, would have kind of a reaction, at least at the beginning, to working in an environment like that. And then you maybe have the other end of the spectrum where some bigger, older companies are, which is there's almost like no feedback. And it sort of like ends up being this very passive aggressive environment, right? Where you kind of don't know, am I doing well? I don't know. I'm not really, my manager, is he my friend? Is he, right? So you get, you know, there's I think a sweet spot about, and there are ways to do feedback that kind of lubricates the social awkwardness without going all the way to this sort of Ray Dalio extreme that I think is really important to think about, and not enough management, CEO, C-suite types actually have that conversation.
Clear that sort of rigid reporting structures don't work in 2019. I think a lot of it honestly is training the people who report to you to sort of learn how to speak in a way that makes sense to the CTO. Getting back to this conversation about, you know, some engineer is just going to say, oh, well, the build system is blah. And like the CEO doesn't want to hear that. Right. And so many meetings I've been in where like my boss's boss wanted to hear just a straight answer from somebody. This is like way back when I was an engineer. And I knew that I didn't know how to communicate the way that he wanted me to. And I would have loved some training at that time. I was starting out in my career. Like, how is it that I'm supposed to talk to this guy? And I think that's some of what we help people with too.
I love that. Yeah, I think my current philosophy is that communication wants to be unbridled. Yeah. And we just have to build the relationships behind that communication so that the communication happens in a way that is respectful and considerate and empathic. It's not necessarily the transmitting of the words that is the issue. It's the underlying relational challenges that I try and build and work on and focus on.
That's actually a huge part of the value that 7 CTOs provides, is like CTOs get to talk to each other, right? And understand, okay, I'm having trouble with this. How do you guys do things? I think that's wonderful. And part of the audit service that we do kind of looks at a set of 10 or 12 different aspects, like how frequent are reviews, what is the 360 nature of the review. I think every company has to have a 360 sort of mechanism, one way or the other, and there are some that are better than others. I think, again, at my first company, the 360 nature of how they did sort of the people at the bottom telling the people at the top what was going on was there was an external consultant that would come once a year and interview everybody. And so once a year, that guy would receive everybody's complaints and gripes and frustrations. I don't know how much he got paid, but it must have been a lot, right? But the point is, this guy wasn't very technical. And so you'd say something like, oh, the continuous integration system is broken. And he'd write down like the continual integral system. It's like, this isn't helping me, right? And so I think a lot of the sort of the nature of how 360 feedback has to work has to be like through a mechanism that sort of respects understanding like deep down, what are their problems? What are people's problems? I think that's super critical.
One I think key term that we like to look at is alignment. So in other words, if you're doing your performance management correctly, what you sort of get is a natural alignment in the org on what the top issues are. So what's interesting is people underestimate just how related running the business is with doing performance management of your people. They're actually sort of one and the same. So what I mean by alignment is if the people down, like even your new hires, your seniors, and your staff engineers understand what are the top issues of the company, and the people at the top understand what the issues are at the bottom. If you have that sort of top to bottom alignment, then actually it sort of implies naturally that you're doing something right in performance management, right? Then of course there's the obvious stuff to audit, like do people perceive the company as fair and those kinds of things we talked about. But really, if you can get the alignment top to bottom in your staff, you're really going to do well in terms of your ability to retain people, and you'll get a sense of mission. That's another question we get is how do we get our people to work harder? Well, actually, first of all, I think if people believe in the mission, and I think you guys know this as CTOs, right? If they really believe deeply in what they're doing, they're gonna work hard. So performance management is not about, extracting more out of people. It's just the opposite. It's getting them to understand the mission of the company, right? So that everyone can be sort of, do their best.
This is a conversation I've had at least a dozen times in the last year. Somebody says to me, like somebody in a leadership position says, hey, like my guys, they just don't want to make any decisions. Like, why do I have to do everything? Right. And I say to them, okay, well, what happens if they make a decision and you don't end up agreeing with it? And then like, they just sort of pause, right? Because they know they just walked into a trap, right? It's like, they know that they're going to like metaphorically yell at somebody. And then all you're doing is incentivizing that person to never make another decision as long as they work in that job. And so that's like happens all the time.
Yeah, I had a revelation about that this week when someone royally screwed up a decision. And I was just reflecting on how decisions actually decisions provide information, whereas indecision provides nothing. And so I always used to have a problem with people saying, oh, well, just make a decision. It's better than no decision. But now I understand that it's really the information that we gather from making those decisions, even when it is the most junior person deciding to put a pop-up on your front page that scrapes all the leads away from the sales team. So we have about 10 minutes left. I do want you guys to jump in and ask some questions, but just give me the solid reference for what you want to see CTOs accomplishing and doing and taking care of and being diligent about. I love sort of the quick drop around how frequently are people given an opportunity to provide feedback. Mm-hmm. Can you just give us sort of I'm envisioning a square and I want to know the 4 points kind of thing. I just want to know, what do we as CTOs have to focus on, keep working at, and what have you seen?
Yeah, I one sort of thumbnail way to say that is I think of 5 dimensions, right? So you've got your technology team best practices. You've got what I would call data management. I'm going to write them off here quick. We can follow up later if you want. We got program management, performance management, and hiring. You can think of those 5 categories a little bit. Like usually when we start working with clients, that's where we kind of start. We do this diagnostic across those 5 dimensions. So technology best practices, stuff like we talked about technical debt, it's stuff that should be motherhood and apple pie, but it's an interesting discussion like, regression testing, how you operate your main line in software at least. And then we kind of work through the other dimensions. So like Agustin, you have an interesting kind of ask. What I like about the partnership I have with Agustin is he has a unique view of data management, I think, from quant trading. Agustin.
Yeah, because I mean, yeah, that's the thing about data, right? Like it's the business story of the last 3-4 years, and probably will be going forward. But trading has certainly lived in this world for at least 20 years, right? Like the idea that data is the thing that defines whether you're going to do well in business or not is like, that's always been the case, or I mean, it has been for 20 years. And so it's like, what data do I need? How do I collect it, manage it, synthesize it? Diverse data sets, like how do I use machine learning, regulatory issues? Like a lot of CTOs I talk to have questions about that. And it's just becoming more important. So that's kind of the data side of it. We haven't talked about hiring, which I think is actually super important too, but man, there's only so much time we have.
Well, none of us have any hiring issues, so I think we're good. So I love that. So sort of the technical management, the data management. So let's work through that. So then what do you mean by program management?
So program management is really all about planning and execution. So like in particular, I've personally deployed Agile Scrum. I don't know if some of you are Agile practitioners. So I'm comfortable with Agile, but I am not, and Essilen is not an Agile,
evangelist.
We're not evangelists for Agile, right? Really, it's about whether you can, so this dimension, Etienne, I think is whether you can predictably produce a product, right? So you should look at a CTO, like, how do you come up with milestones? How reliably do you hit your schedules? I actually think is really important. Actually have a kind of a ledger of what is your reliability in terms of hitting a deadline. That's actually a really important reputation that you want to build in your company, right? And then, again, actually that ties in nicely with Agustin does with being able to deal with probabilistic situations, and dealing with uncertainty is one of the things we teach to help with that kind of scheduling aspect.
Yeah, the hiring question is super interesting because, I mean, we live in a knowledge economy, right? And so the quality of your hires defines the quality of your company. Like it's really that simple. I added it up a few months ago. I've conducted on the order of 1,800 interviews in my life, and kind of top to bottom, all sorts of positions. And it's abundantly clear that I thought I was good at interviewing and hiring. And then the more I did it, the more I realized I was terrible at it. And then like there's sort of this trough of disillusionment that I'm slowly kind of digging myself out of for the last few hundred interviews that I've done. Because like super great candidates, like they can sort of walk with their feet, or they can sort of vote with their feet and go wherever they want, right? And so a lot of what we do with clients is, to use a poker analogy, is like you're basically looking at their leaks, right? Like where are they kind of leaking good candidates in their process, right? Like, is it where they're looking for them? Is it how they're interviewing them? I mean, I think we're all past the give them the hardest interview question you can think of way of interviewing people. I hope we're all past that. But even just like once you make a hiring decision, the point they have an offer in their hand, once they have the offer in their hand and they're deciding between different things, like what does that sort of hand-holding process look like? I think all of these things are super critical. What does that pipeline look like? Once you onboard them, what do those first few weeks look like for them? Those first few weeks are super, super critical, right? And I think a lot of companies I talk to, it's like, oh, well, I'm just going to get them to check out the code base and maybe make some changes where it doesn't really matter if they screw up. And like, if you're a small team, you could probably get away with that. But as soon as you start growing, that quickly becomes just completely unmanageable.
And then when you start growing, it's so important to have a strategy about what are you hiring for? Especially now, right? It's so much easier now. You can offshore work. You can hire contract labor so much easier now. You really have to think hard about what do I want my full-time employees to do? Like, what is my core set of skills that I want to build? As opposed to just sort of I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, you would just sort of hire on a sort of need basis to get tasks done. And now I think you have much more choice about how you staff projects. You have to be really mindful about it.
So basically, I've got a lot of interest in my organization right now. It's a 16-year-old code base, and we have some people who are saying, I don't want to do product work. I just want to help fix the infrastructure. So I've kind of pressed them on this a little because we have a need to get out a lot of our product work, but our infrastructure is pretty gnarly too. So I've been pressing them on, well, how are you going to measure this? What are the KPIs that are going to determine if you are successful in all of the stuff that you're wanting to do? And they came back with developer happiness. And that is obviously a fool's errand to try to quantify. So I've got two questions. What are your thoughts on having teams dedicated to nothing but infrastructure? And what are some useful KPIs? How do you measure whether or not they're successful?
Right. So once a team gets to a certain size, I think it is, if you don't have an explicit infrastructure team, one will get created for you, whether you like it or not. So I think that that's kind of an important thing to say, right? Like you're going to get to a size and somebody's just going to be doing infra, whether you like them to or not. In terms of KPIs, I think you have to start with developer pain points, right? Like if you have like a mono repo and the build takes 10 hours to do, right? Like, okay, that's the pain, that's like the KPI. We're going to sort of decrease this down to something manageable. If it's tooling or something, like, okay, let's identify exactly what in your tooling needs work.
One tip I would give you would be to treat your infrastructure like your product, right? So for your product, you're used to doing this all the time. You're used to making these priority calls. Like if you're an agile practitioner, you have a backlog, right? And you groom the backlog and you stack rank the most important things. And most companies have a lot of arguments over, good, healthy arguments, right? Over how to prioritize your product work. So just do the same thing with the infrastructure, I think is important. One thing that I think your instincts are right is that engineers will, I call it the polishing the diamond tendency. They will tend, they get something that looks pretty good and they want to polish it even more. So that's the bias you have to guard against with an infrastructure team, is they'll just want to keep making the diamond shinier and shinier. So you have to guard against that. But philosophically, having an infrastructure team, I think Augustin's right. You're either going to have one, made for you, or have some dedicated folks. There's different ways to set it up, but I think your instincts are right.
And one more thing on that bias for like polishing things up. I think one of the ways that bias expresses itself is when the tooling gets like really Baroque. It's like it's super, super slick. Like everything just kind of ping, bing, bing, bing. It all kind of works. But then you get a new hire come in and you realize you have to train him for like 4 months to understand your tooling. And it's like, okay, well, maybe we've gone too far. Like it's a really elegant system, but it takes a long time to sort of learn, right? Maybe you've gone too far, right? These kinds of things.
What you're getting at is you're going to have to kind of work with your team on creating a measure of efficiency. Like, what does it mean? Like, express that numerically somehow. Like one that I like to kind of talk about is what is sort of the minimum time required to get a change through the system. That's a nice thing to think about because, let's say, if it takes a long time, whatever that is in your case, to get a change to the system, you got to kind of ask, well, why is that? Is that because we have a whole bunch of technical debt? In which case, it's not really infrastructure we need to attack, it's the technical debt. Or is it really because we have sort of, infrastructure problems? But I think it sort of starts with what we kind of said earlier, try to put a number on what is our current efficiency and how would we measure that, and do it as a team exercise so everybody buys in on that. And then once you agree, okay, our efficiency is X, and next year we want to be at 20% better than X, you can have that, then you can have the product discussion on how to get.
By the way, just asking that question of your team, like, how do we measure developer efficiency? You can start with it kind of in some kind of like team builder after work. Like, how would you're going to get, at least if you haven't done it, you're going to get the broadest set of answers you could ever imagine. This is like philosophical catnip for developers, but it sort of gets them thinking about, things in maybe a slightly more general way. And I think sort of good conversations result from that. And when somebody, like, a lot of the times when you create technical debt is when somebody doesn't quite have enough time to do the right thing. And so they do the thing they need to do to get it out. And so if you just have some conventions surrounding, like, highlight technical debt in all caps, colon, inside a comment, I believe doing this right is going to take another 1.5 weeks or person weeks of time. Well, like, if you have people who are decent at estimating this, just add it up, right? Like it's pretty obvious, but I don't see a whole lot of people doing it. The key there is, like, you want to actually estimate a number. You want to be forced to put a number down on what it's going to take to do it right. I think, like, it has to be super lightweight. It has to take no more than a few seconds, right?
I can't tell you the number of code reviews I've been in as a software developer, where, like, a principal engineer would say, hey, like, this really isn't the right thing to do it. And then the response is, well, the customer has a gun to my head. So like, okay, all right, fine, I'll let it go. Right. And so it's that moment in time you're trying to capture. And if you miss that moment, it's gone. You'll never remember it.
So when we do an audit with people, we spend about a week kind of all in. We spend a few days kind of doing interviews or surveys and that sort of thing. What we produce at the end is just kind of like a report. And the executive summary is basically 2 pages of, like, red, green, blue, right? Like, where you're sort of behind, at, or ahead of what we consider your peers in sort of all of these dimensions, right? Just kind of like a checkup on your car, right? But then the rest of it is sort of very detailed, actionable things, like, number one thing we believe you could be fixing is this thing, and here's how you could be fixing it. And if it's the kind of thing where we could help you fix it, then, like, we'll sort of tell you, like, this is kind of a preliminary statement on work and what it would take to fix it. Our whole goal here is sort of teach people how to do it themselves. I think that's kind of the number one thing, because I know I've been on the other side of it. I know Paul has been on the other side of it, kind of hiring external people to do things. You really want to make sure, again, you align the interests, your interests and their interests. So, like for example, we don't charge by the hour, because that just seems completely counterintuitive and not aligned with kind of the client, right? Like, that's crazy to sort of charge by the hour. You know what I mean?
And I think the partnership with 7 CTOs is really cool, because imagine now you're in, you guys already have this fantastic network. So now imagine, like, in your group of 7, you all have your reports, and you're able to kind of talk about it, right? I'm sure some of you are going to be really great at some things. Some of you need to pick up on some other things. You guys could, as a group, work through your problems. I think that's pretty cool. That's why we're excited to work with you guys.
Yeah, I think I think one of the things that always comes up for us in our forums is, how is what I'm doing comparing to my peers? Am I slightly ahead, the same, or am I slightly behind?
Exactly.
And I think anecdotally and through conversation, a lot of that stuff comes up and is addressed. I've often wondered about a more formal, like, you join 7 CTOs, this is what your systems and processes looks like compared to your peers. And I'm assuming you guys have a larger database of people to compare to.
That's right.
And then you have actionable items. And then it just demystifies the road ahead. Like, I have to work on these couple things versus just naturally working on the things you like to do and neglecting the rest.
Exactly.
Right. And the whole thing is, again, it's sort of like a bootstrap. Like, we've screwed up so many times in our careers that, if we can kind of give you the benefit of our screw ups, I think that's always a bit of help, right?